My name is Vivian, and I'm 29 years old. I used to believe that when everything falls apart, family is the one thing that holds. I believe that completely. The way you believe in gravity. The way you believe the floor will be there when you take a step. That belief broke on a Tuesday in February at 11:42 at night in the back of an ambulance on the I-90 outside of Chicago. I'd been driving home from a late shift at the community health clinic where I worked as a patient advocate. The roads were iced over in that invisible, deceptive way Chicago winters do. Looks fine until your tires disagree. A pickup truck ran a red light. The impact spun my car into the median barrier. I remember the sound more than anything, and then I remember nothing for a while. When I woke up, I was in the trauma bay at Northwestern Memorial. My left arm was broken in 2 places. 3 ribs were cracked. And there was a bleed in my abdomen they needed to address surgically. A young ER resident, Dr. Tubal N. Tubal, Paddle, I still remember his name, crouched down to my level and explained what needed to happen. He was calm, specific. He told me the surgical team wanted to move quickly, but there was a complication. Because of a previous allergic reaction I'd had to a standard anesthetic agent, they needed to use an alternative protocol. Hospital policy flagged it for next of kin notification before proceeding. Not consent exactly, notification. A formality, the charge nurse said, but someone needed to be reachable. My phone was cracked down the middle. The screen still worked. I called my mother first. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called my father. Same. I called my mother again. On the 4th attempt, she picked up. Vivian. Her voice was flat, a little impatient. I could hear dinner sounds in the background. Glasses, soft music. I told her where I was. I told her what happened. There was a pause. Then, how bad is it really? Because your father and I are in the middle of a dinner with the Harmons. We drove 40 minutes for this. I didn't say anything for a second. I think I thought I'd heard her wrong. Mom, I'm at Northwestern. They need to do emergency surgery. I need you too. Vivian, we can't just leave. This is an important relationship for your father's firm. Can the hospital not just proceed? You're an adult. She said it the way you'd say it about a minor inconvenience. Can they not just proceed? As if I'd called to ask her to pick something up from the drugstore and the timing was a little inconvenient. I'll have your father call you back, she said. Just stay calm. She hung up. I lay there, under the fluorescent lights, my arm immobilized, an IV in my hand, and I looked at the cracked screen of my phone. Have you ever had a moment where a truth you'd been quietly avoiding your entire life becomes completely irreversibly clear? Like something finally stops pretending to be something else? That was that moment for me. The floor I'd always assumed was there, just wasn't. My father never called back. What came instead, 20 minutes later, was a text. We're at dinner. Is this something that can wait until morning? The hospital has doctors for a reason. The nurse, her name was Asha, and she had the kindest eyes I've ever seen on a person who was clearly exhausted, saw my face and came over without me asking. Is there someone else we can try to reach? She said. A sibling? Another family member? I gave her the only other number I had memorized, my grandmother. My father's mother, 81 years old, living alone in a small ranch house in Evanston, 25 minutes away. I almost didn't call because it was nearly midnight and she went to bed at 9 and I didn't want to frighten her. Asha made the call for me. She came back 3 minutes later. She's on her way, she said. She told me to tell you she's bringing the good blanket. I started crying. Not because I was scared, though I was. Because of the blanket? Because she'd thought of the blanket. My grandmother, I call her Gram, arrived in 57 minutes, which meant she'd left the house almost immediately after hanging up. She was wearing her winter coat over her pajamas, her silver hair not quite combed, and she had a folded quilt under her arm, the old blue one she'd made herself, hand-stitched over 2 winters. The one that lived on the back of her reading chair. She walked straight to me, put her hand on my face, and said, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." And that was enough. That was more than enough. She spoke to the surgical team with a clarity that surprised them, I think. She asked the right questions. What was the alternative protocol? What were the specific risks compared to standard anesthesia? What was the expected recovery window? She'd spent 40 years married to a man who had 3 surgeries in his last decade of life. She knew how to talk to doctors. She signed the notification form with a hand that didn't shake. And then she held my good hand until they wheeled me back. When I came out of surgery, she was in the chair beside my bed. The blue quilt was draped over her lap. She was doing a word-find puzzle from a small book she must have brought in her coat pocket. She looked up when she heard me stir and said, "There she is." Just that. I don't know how to describe what it felt like to see her. It cracked something open that I'd been keeping sealed for a very long time. My parents showed up 2 days later. My mother walked in first, assessed the room the way she assessed every room, quickly looking for what it said about the people in it, and then settled her gaze on me with an expression I can only describe as managed sympathy. "You look pale," she said. "Are they keeping you hydrated?" My father stood near the door. He was wearing his work coat, which meant he'd come from the office or was going to the office, and he had his phone in his hand. He glanced up from it briefly. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "When are they talking about discharge?" Not "are you in pain?" Not "we were so scared." Timeline. My mother sat in the visitor chair and spent the next 20 minutes describing a problem she was having with a contractor who was redoing their kitchen backsplash. She said it twice, once as a story, once as a complaint. My father took 2 phone calls. They left after about half an hour, my mother squeezing my fingers at the door and saying, "You're tough, Vivian. You'll be fine." The room was quieter after they left, but not in a good way. 3 days later, the discharge planning conversation happened. The attending physician, a careful, thorough woman named Dr. Osei, sat with me and explained the recovery requirements clearly. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Wicker Park. With a broken arm and cracked ribs, I couldn't manage those stairs for at least 6 weeks. I'd need to be somewhere accessible, ideally 1 level. Before I could even begin to figure out what that meant, my grandmother, who had been there every single day, said from her chair in the corner, "She's staying with me." Dr. Osei looked at her. "Do you have a 1-level home?" "Ranch house," Graham said. 1 level, wide doorways, grab bars in the bathroom already because I put them in myself 3 years ago. I have a guest room that's been waiting for something useful to do. That was that. Moving into her house felt like something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Everything was soft and warm and smelled like the cedar sachets she kept in her closets. She brought meals to me, real meals, things she'd cooked, soup with actual vegetables she'd chopped herself, not something poured from a can. She sat with me through the physical therapy exercises that made me want to cry. She didn't try to fill every silence. Sometimes we just watched old quiz shows in the evenings, her in her reading chair, me propped up on the pull-out sofa, and it was the most peaceful I'd felt in longer than I could remember. But at night, when the house was quiet, I'd lie awake with a question I didn't want to have. Why, after everything, after the dinner and the text and the timeline question, did I still check my phone, half hoping for a message, a real one? Not logistics, just something that said they were worried, that they'd thought about me. I'd studied this in a roundabout way through my work. The concept is called trauma bonding. It's what happens when you grow up in an environment where emotional attention is unpredictable. Sometimes present, sometimes completely absent. Your nervous system learns to chase the moments when the warmth appears. You become wired to see the rare good moment as worth all the empty ones. You don't keep hoping because you're weak. You keep hoping because you're trained to, by people who were never consistent enough to be trusted, but never absent enough to be given up on. My parents were exactly that, not monstrous, not abusive in any obvious way, just unavailable. My father ran a mid-sized investment advisory firm on the North Shore. My mother handled their marketing and client relations. They were successful. They were respected at their country club. They showed up at the things that mattered to their image, and they sent a check to the things that didn't. I remembered telling them at 22 that I wanted to work in healthcare advocacy. My mother had tilted her head like I'd said something in a foreign language. That's very admirable, she said. But what does it pay? I remembered my father when I found my apartment in Wicker Park. Small, third floor, but mine, my first truly independent space, saying only, that neighborhood's improving. You bought at the right time. Not proud of me. Proud of the real estate decision. My grandmother, when I'd called her about the same apartment, had driven in from Evanston on a Saturday with a box of dish towels and a set of mixing bowls she bought at a garage sale because she knew I liked to bake. She'd walked every room with me, opened every window, said, "This is yours. You built this." She was always the one who showed up. And now, in her guest room, surrounded by her quilts and her cedar sachets, I lay awake thinking about all the times she'd been the only one. The mail started arriving. My neighbor from the building, a retired postal worker named Ted, who'd known I was out and had been collecting it, brought over a canvas tote bag stuffed full. "Didn't want it piling up out front," he said, apologetic. "Figured you'd want to sort through when you were ready." I thanked him and brought it to my grandmother's kitchen table. Most of it was what I expected: medical bills, explanation of benefit statements from my insurance, some forwarded mail from before the accident. I had a solid disability insurance policy do my job. I'd set it up carefully when I started, because working in healthcare had made me acutely aware of exactly this kind of situation. I also had a small investment account I built slowly over 5 years, nothing impressive, but real. Something I'd done entirely on my own. I started with the disability insurance claim. Assuming there'd be paperwork to initiate, I called the provider, gave my claim number, went through the verification steps. The representative on the other end asked me to hold for a moment while she pulled my account. When she came back, her voice had a careful quality to it, the voice of someone choosing their words. "Miss Calloway," she said, "I want to make sure I understand your situation correctly. We've had several contacts on this account since your accident from the authorized representatives." My stomach went cold. "I'm sorry. Which authorized representatives?" "The two individuals listed as financial power of attorney on your supplemental disability policy, your mother and your father." I didn't say anything for several seconds. "They contacted us first on the Thursday after your accident," she continued. "They were asking about the process for a full liquidation of your benefit account. Not a claim, a liquidation. Not accessing benefits I was owed because I was injured. Liquidating the account entirely. Moving the money out." I thought back 3 years. My father, at his kitchen counter on a Sunday, telling me that getting my financial documents in order was important, smart, responsible. "Let me and your mom be listed as financial POA," he'd said, sliding a folder across the counter. "It's just a safeguard. If something happens to you and you can't communicate you don't want the accounts frozen, it's standard. The advisor I use for all my clients does it." I'd felt, in that moment, like he was finally paying attention to my life. Like he saw me as an adult he wanted to protect. He had been building a trapdoor. My hands were shaking, but not the way they had in the ER. This was different. Colder, more deliberate. I thanked the representative, asked her to flag the account and make no changes without my direct, verbal, confirmed authorization, and hung up. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, breezy, like he was expecting a normal conversation. I asked him directly, why had he contacted my disability insurance company about liquidating my account? The breezy quality vanished. "Vivian." His tone shifted, the one he used with difficult clients, smooth and slightly condescending. "We were monitoring your accounts. That's what a POA is for. The market's been volatile. We were exploring restructuring options to protect the principal." Restructuring it to where exactly? Silence. "Dad, where was the money going?" "There are some cash flow issues at the firm." The smoothness cracked. The exhausted, irritated man underneath came through. "It's a bridge. A short-term situation. You would have been repaid." A bridge. The money I would need to pay my bills and my medical costs, while I physically could not work, was going to be used as a short-term loan to patch a cash flow problem at his company. Without asking me. While I was in surgery. I hung up. I sat for a moment at the table. Then I went through the rest of the mail. I found it in a plain envelope from a financial institution I'd never heard of. It was a loan rejection letter, not for a credit card, not for a personal line of credit. It was a rejection for a home equity line of credit. The address listed as the property being leveraged was mine, my condo in Wicker Park. My father had co-signed on my mortgage 4 years ago because my credit history was thin. I was 25. I'd been careful and responsible, but I didn't have the years of credit behind me that underwriters wanted. He'd offered, insisted actually. It's a formality, he said. I'll be off the title in 3 years, once you've built your history. He'd never removed himself. The application was dated 5 days after my accident. While I was in the ICU, he had attempted to draw equity from my home. My home. The thing I had spent 4 years building, paying for, maintaining, the only significant asset I had in the world. I put the letter down on the table. Graham was in the doorway. She'd been there long enough to read my face. She didn't ask what was wrong, she just waited. I picked up the letter and held it out to her. She crossed the room, took it, and read it. I watched her face change, a quiet, controlled tightening, the kind of anger that doesn't perform itself. She read it twice, then she set it on the table, smoothed it flat with her palm, and walked to the old roll-top desk she kept in the corner of the living room. She came back with a small address book, the kind no one has kept in decades, brown leather with her handwriting filling every page. She flipped through it, running her finger down a column of names, and stopped. She picked up the phone, her landline, the one that still had a cord, and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Lorraine," she said. "It's Edith. Yes, I know it's been too long. I'm calling because my granddaughter needs help and I think you're the right person." She listened for a moment, then handed the phone to me. "She's going to hear you out. Tell her everything." Lorraine was a semi-retired estate attorney my grandmother had known since they were in the same neighborhood book club 30 years ago. She listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting. I told her everything: the dinner, the text, the disability insurance, the home equity application. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Vivian," she said, "what your father attempted to do with that HELOC application is potentially fraudulent. He used a co-signatory position he held in a fiduciary capacity and attempted to extract equity from your property without your knowledge or consent while you were incapacitated. That's not a gray area, that's actionable." She paused. "And the disability insurance situation isn't much cleaner. They had POA authority, but liquidating, not claiming, liquidating, a policy that exists specifically to benefit you while you're recovering from a covered injury is a direct breach of fiduciary duty." "What do I do?" I asked. "You rest," she said. "You heal. I'm going to draft an immediate revocation of all power of attorney, medical and financial, both of them. I'll also draft a cease and desist and file protective notices with both the insurance company and your mortgage servicer. I'll have the documents ready in 2 days. When you're steady enough, we'll set the meeting." When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief. It was too early for that, but something solid under my feet, like a floor I could actually trust. 3 weeks after the accident, I called my parents and asked them to come to my grandmother's house. I told them I had some documents I needed them to look at. I didn't explain further. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, my father in a blazer, my mother in the kind of casual but intentional outfit she wore to things she considered beneath her, but attended anyway. My father walked in and his eyes went immediately around the room, calculating, and then he stopped. I was sitting in the armchair by the window. My broken arm was in a brace. I had one crutch propped against the side table. On the coffee table in front of me were 2 manila envelopes. Beside me, on the small sofa, sat my grandmother, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. Across from her, in the wing chair my grandmother usually reserved for guests, sat Lorraine, dressed in a charcoal blazer, her reading glasses on, a legal pad open across her knee. "What is this?" my mother asked. "Please sit down," I said. They sat. My father kept his eyes on Lorraine. He recognized what she was immediately. I slid one envelope across the coffee table toward them. "These are the revocation documents. They revoke, effective immediately, all powers of attorney you hold over me, financial and medical. They also remove you as representatives from my disability insurance account and as co-signatories from my property documents, to the extent legally possible. Lorraine has already filed protective notices with my insurance provider and my mortgage servicer. My mother's hand went to her collarbone. Vivian, we were trying to help you. We were managing things while you couldn't. You filed a HELOC application on my home 5 days after my accident, I said, not loudly, just clearly, while I was in the ICU. The room went silent. My father's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, that I knew. Then calculation, what could be explained away. Then, when he looked at Lorraine's legal pad and the careful, expensive stillness of someone who had been doing this for decades, something emptied out of his expression entirely. The firm has been going through a difficult period, he said finally. His voice was quieter now, almost tired. I made a decision that I thought I could correct before it became an issue. It became an issue, I said. My mother had tears on her face. We're your parents, Vivian. You can't just. You told me to calm down, I said. When I called you from the trauma bay, you told me to calm down and said you'd have Dad call me back. And then he texted me to ask if it could wait until morning. I looked at her steadily. I just needed you to come. That's all I needed. She didn't say anything. My father picked up the pen Lorraine had placed beside the envelope. His hand wasn't steady. He signed where the tabs indicated, flipped to the next page, signed again. He slid it to my mother. She signed without reading it, which I thought said everything about how this family had always operated. They stood up. My father didn't look at me. My mother paused at the door and said in a smaller voice than I'd ever heard from her, I hope you heal quickly. Then the door closed, and the three of us, me, my grandmother, Lorraine, sat in the quiet. My grandmother reached over and put her hand on mine. That was all. The weeks after were about reconstruction. Lorraine helped me open new accounts at a different bank, set up new credentials for everything financial, place fraud alerts on my credit report. I had the mortgage reviewed thoroughly and worked with a housing attorney to understand exactly what protections I had against any future unauthorized activity on the property. My father's name would take time to fully remove from the mortgage, but the process was started. I did not sell the condo. I thought about it, but I'd chosen that apartment. I painted that kitchen myself on an October weekend with a playlist I still remember. I'd hung my own curtains, assembled my own furniture, had my grandmother over for the first dinner I'd ever hosted. My father had seen it as a leverageable asset. I refused to let that be the final meaning it held. I went back to work 6 weeks after the accident. My job was already doing something to protect people in vulnerable moments, connecting patients with resources, helping them navigate systems that weren't designed to be easy. But the experience had shown me a specific gap I'd never fully seen before. People who were injured or recovering were extraordinarily exposed, financially, legally, in ways that most of them had no framework to anticipate or defend. I wrote a proposal, carefully and over several drafts, for a new initiative, a partnership with a local legal aid organization to provide free financial and legal consultations for patients during or immediately after major medical events. My supervisor read it twice and approved it for the next grant cycle. On a Friday evening in late spring, I had people over for the first time since the accident. My grandmother brought her blue quilt and folded it over my reading chair because she said it belonged somewhere it would be seen. Asha, the nurse from the ER, came with her husband and a bottle of wine. Ted from my building brought cookies. He'd clearly bought from a bakery but presented as homemade, and I let him have that. Lorraine stopped by for an hour, drank half a glass of sparkling water, and said the apartment had good light. We sat around my kitchen table in mismatched chairs, eating off my hand-painted ceramic plates, the ones I'd made 2 summers ago at a pottery class I'd taken by myself on a whim. I'd filled them with roasted vegetables and pasta and a salad my grandmother had insisted on contributing. At one point, I looked around the table and thought, this is it. This is the version of it that's actually real. I don't think you have to hate the people who let you down to be done with them. I don't hate my parents. I think I understand them, finally, in a way that no longer requires me to manage the understanding carefully, to file it somewhere out of sight. They built a life around what things were worth, and somewhere along the way they applied that same framework to the people in it, including me. That's a sad way to live. It's not my problem anymore. What I know now is this. The family that matters is the one that gets in the car at midnight and drives 25 minutes in their pajamas because you need them. It's the one that asks the right questions and brings the right blanket and stays until morning. It's the one that hands you an address book when you're scared and says, "She'll hear you out." You don't have to keep proving yourself to people who are never really paying attention. You're allowed to stop. And when you do, you'll find that the people who are always actually watching, they've been there all along. I think about the version of me who was lying in that trauma bay, phone cracked, waiting for a callback that never came. She still believed, at that point, that if the situation were serious enough, the right people would show up. That's the thing about growing up in a family where love was conditional and inconsistent. You don't stop believing, you just keep raising the bar for what serious enough means. Car accident, emergency surgery, internal bleeding. And still a part of me thought, maybe this will be the thing that finally gets through. It wasn't. And that truth, as painful as it was also the most clarifying moment of my life. What I understand now is that consequences are not punishment. They're just the natural result of what people choose, repeated over time. My parents spent years choosing their image over their daughter, their dinner reservations over a hospital room, their firm's cash flow over my financial security. Each of those choices was small enough to dismiss individually. Taken together, they built something, a pattern, a record, a relationship that had real shape and real weight. The legal papers I brought to my grandmother's living room 3 weeks after the accident weren't revenge. They were just the outcome of their own accumulation of choices finally becoming visible and permanent. And my choices had an accumulation too. The years I spent building something genuinely my own, my career, my apartment, my savings, even the small investment account I'd funded dollar by dollar, those weren't just practical decisions. They were, I think, an unconscious act of integrity. I'd been raised to measure worth in dollar amounts and social returns, and I'd quietly, stubbornly refused to live that way. I took a job that paid less because it meant something. I bought a condo in a neighborhood I loved because I wanted to live in it, not because of what it would be worth in 5 years. Those weren't grand moral statements. They were just choices made from a real sense of what I actually valued. And when the crisis came, that groundwork held. What I didn't expect was how much the hard part would require me to think clearly, not emotionally, clearly. When I found the he-like rejection letter, there was a moment where I could have collapsed into the grief of it, the sheer scale of the betrayal. Instead, something steadied. I called the insurance company. I asked the right questions. I remembered what I'd learned about protective filings and legal notices through my work. I asked my grandmother for her address book. Falling apart was not going to protect me. Understanding what had actually happened and what options I had was that clarity, the willingness to face a hard situation with a clear head instead of a numb one. That's the thing I'm most grateful I found. And then there was the part that required me to just keep going when keeping going was exhausting. 6 weeks of recovery, physical therapy that hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated, learning to do ordinary things one-handed, going back to work knowing the colleagues there had covered for me, writing a funding proposal for a new program while my arm was still in a brace, because I believed in it and I didn't want to wait. None of that was dramatic. It was just daily. One day after another, until the days added up into something that looks like a rebuilt life. Graham brought the blue quilt to my apartment and draped it over my reading chair. She said it belonged somewhere it would be seen. I think she meant it the same way she'd meant everything she'd ever done for me. That some things are built to last, and the people who build them don't need you to make a fuss. They just need you to let the thing stay. I let it stay.